discussion with Ms. Claudia Mo just outside the room. Mr. Eddie Chu, 3 minutes. Thank you. Thank you, Chairman. The officials said that Clause 9 is to require these S4E to give directions, then the autonomy of schools as well as adaptation of the national anthem law can be both taken care of. And this will not be against the principle of autonomy of our schools. But I don't think this is a valid argument. There is now a middleman between Beijing and schools, but then the fact is there will be some consequences for schools, although no one can be specific about what they are, but schools will face some consequences and the autonomy of schools will be affected. And somebody might have already raised this issue. When the S4E is now responsible, then through Article 18 of the Basic Law, the Beijing government has required the SARG to teach the national anthem, and this is against Article 136 of the Basic Law, where educational institutions can make their own policies. Mr. Duchu, I think what you said was a valid question. Can I invite the Secretary to answer that question first? Yes, please do. I think we answered this question when we had a policy discussion. Our requirement is to let students learn to sing the national anthem in primary and secondary school, and to learn about the history and spirit of the national anthem and the etiquette for playing the national anthem. I think this is a very legitimate requirement, and many schools are already doing that. That's point number one. And secondly, how can we reflect the this national law into our local legislation? It is for S4E to give directions. So the SL government is responsible for the implementation. So we have taken care of the requirement under national law, and we also address that through our local education system. I have repeatedly made this point. And please tell us whether this is in contradiction with Article 136 of the Basic Law. Well, we're using our own educational system to implement this requirement, so it is in full compliance with Article 136. Well, for the adaptation of the national flag law, now, schools are required in that law to have a flag raising ceremony once a week, but this is not in our local legislation. So I think you have passed the line in this arrangement. You may seek a second round. Mr. Leung Yu-chung, 3 minutes. Thank you. The government said that directions or guidelines can be considered. I wanted to thank him, but then after what Ms. Claudia Mo said, the Secretary said that it would be more appropriate to use the word directions, and that was echoed by the law draftsman afterwards. So which is more appropriate, directions or guidelines? I looked up the dictionary myself. Directions can mean to
可以去做 order 嘅意思有存在喺度喎。咁 order 係咩意思咧？主席，我諗你一定識嘅，就係
to order.
You must do 咁樣嘅，即係話
That means directions has the meaning of order. So this is rather scary.
咁樣存在喺度嘅。咁所以我
So another I'd like to ask the law draftsman and the secretary once again, are you going to replace the word direction with guidelines? And members have been asking what will be the consequence of not following the directions. You claim that the directions are not binding. Now, if a school principal directs me to teach the national anthem, there is no curriculum on how that should be taught yet, and I refuse to do so because I don't know how to. Will I be penalized or even dismissed because of not following the principal's directions? The first question has already been answered. Any supplement, please? Indeed, I have answered this question a number of times. The law draftsman may want to supplement. Clause 9 requires the S4A to give directions for primary and secondary school education to do what is in subsection 1A and B. And the follow-up mechanism is within the current educational system and mechanism. For the difference between directions and guidelines, I defer to the law draftsman. Well, according to the Oxford Dictionary, directions means
on what to do, how to proceed, where to go， 係冇一個 order 嘅意思喺度嘅。咁我睇緊中文嘅字典咧，都係説明處理。
there is no there isn't the meaning of order. And then the legal advisor also gave some explanation on when the directions are binding, and we believe the word is appropriate, and that is our view. Dr. Fernando Cheung, 3 minutes. May I ask one more question? Well, you press the button again. Dr. Fernando Cheung, 3 minutes. Well, on clause 9, and the S for E must give directions to secondary and primary schools to educate the students on the history and spirit of the national anthem. As pointed out by Mr. Pt2, the spirit and history, the spirit in particular, has appeared in our preamble. Spirit means patriotism. Patriotism is not a defined concept in law. And our leaders, state leaders, from time to time will elaborate on patriotism. And this is the 100th anniversary of the May 4th movement. And presidency said that contemporary patriotism means insists on loving the party, the country, and socialism. That's a direction from the supreme leader of the country. So that being the case, I'm sure there will be some bearing on the directions to be issued by the S4E, and that is exactly what I worry about. Well, being patriotic doesn't mean that you must love the government or you must love the party. So in clause 9, there is the word directions. Will you specify what is covered in the history and spirit of the national anthem? Will the spirit include patriotism as appeared in the preamble, and that patriotism doesn't require students to love the government and also the party? I think that is the concern of Dr. Fernando Cheung. Can you please comment, Under Secretary? Regarding the content of what is to be learned, may I quote some examples as to the content of teaching content. Currently, for instance, in primary education, there is identity to national, being a national, and also, no, you don't have to digress. I'm asking whether in your directions you will clearly spell out that being patriotic doesn't mean that you have to love the party. No, the directions will be updated by the Curriculum Development Council as necessary. So we will not specify which sentence to teach and what not to teach. No, I'm not talking about this. I'm asking about the concept. Clause 9 requires the SYE to give directions to educate students on the history and spirit. I'm worried that the spirit will mean being patriotic means loving the party. You can press the button again. May I remind members that the questions are highly repetitive, so please be more focused. And will any member who would like to speak press the request to speak button? I will draw the line at around 11:30. Mr. James Stowe, I will queue up 2 more times. I want to have 2 more rounds. Can I do so? Because I can only press once. Well, what is it? Well, you want to draw the line. Do you get my point? When I draw the line, I'll let members know. No, because members may come in and out, and therefore I've allowed time for members to do so. All right, at around 11:40. No, I like to ask for 3 rounds. Well, if I see 7 members after me, I may go out and come back. You don't have to worry. After you have pressed the bell, you will for sure have the chance.
Let's start the clock again. On clause 9, it says must give directions. Is this an administrative direction or a statutory direction? Undersecretary? Undersecretary. The Secretary for Education has a responsibility to issue directions, and the directions are a clear requirement. So could the legal draftsman respond? Let's say I'm an official, I wish you to do something, let's say according to the law, according to clause 9, I wish to make some directions. So is that an administrative direction or a statutory direction? Chairman, I see the question is the directions are an administrative duty. The question was the Secretary for Education, do they have a legal responsibility to comply? Yes, let's say he issues instructions that according to the National Anthem ordinance, I issue certain instructions. So the instructions, are they statutory, or the nature of the instructions is it an administrative direction or a statutory direction? The chairman, my understanding is the secretary derives authority from the legislation, and the directions derive their authority from the ordinance, and but the directions themselves are an administrative action. Is clause 9. Well, National Anthem ordinance clause 9 must give. He's not enabled to give. Well, my understanding, draftsman can confirm that, clause 9, it requires the Secretary for Education to give directions. That's the first point. So issuing directions comes from the legislation. So the legislation instructs the Secretary for Education to give directions. And the Secretary for Education, when issuing the directions are based on the existing education system, authorizing the Secretary to give directions to secondary and primary schools. So why isn't it must give directions under the education ordinance? You understand what I'm saying? So So if I'm the secretary, so am I deriving authority from one legislation or the other, another section, or even though there is no penalty? So when I legislate, it should be based on the educational ordinance, or he derives authority from the education ordinance. Mr. Aulakim, 4 minutes. Regarding Clause 9, this is about how the national anthem be taught. So the Secretary and Government should not misunderstand. We feel educational institutions, they have an obligation to teach the national anthem. But we are concerned how it is taught and whether there is sufficient autonomy. Now, I just noted that the Undersecretary mentioned the Curriculum Development Unit, and according to curriculum needs, they can adjust the school curriculum. Now, typically, the Curriculum Development Unit is a consultative body. Now you are legislating, you have to issue guidelines, and the Curriculum Development Unit will have to consider that there is a need for national anthem curriculum. So the Curriculum Development Unit, how will they proceed? Let's say they make a decision, it is in contravention, they feel they have one interpretation of the national anthem ordinance, but there's a different interpretation in the legislation. How will that be resolved? So the Curriculum Development Unit might feel they wish to express a different view. How can they do that? So the problem is, how do we allow the Curriculum Development Unit, how we won't lose our education autonomy? Undersecretary, regarding the Curriculum Development Unit, how they do their job, it is an ongoing process. They will take note of society needs, the changes in our environment and legislation, and provide a suitable curriculum. So the whole process is professional and independent. It's autonomous. So essentially, they will provide their input to our curriculum development department for inspection. Well, the Curriculum Development Unit, they look at the 8 areas of curriculum, and if there's need for sustainable development, they will inform us. I want to repeat, the national anthem is already in Chinese history, music, general studies, include national anthem curriculum. So I don't see how it could be said that we are adding, we are forcefully adding an extra element. The Curriculum Development Unit is just making updates according to changes in society. Now, I just want to point out that even when I received education, when I also learned the national anthem in the process. So my point is, the Curriculum Development Unit, they play an important role. To a certain extent, their views affect the curriculum in primary, secondary schools. So how do they provide, or how is their input included in our primary, secondary education? This is very important. They need to remain autonomous. Ms. Claudia Moe. This is my second turn. I should have a third and fourth speaking opportunity, but you said that you'll draw the line at 11:40, and that does not give me my third and fourth speaking opportunity. So I would like you to note that I would like to speak a third and fourth time. I mentioned that I said so far questions have been repetitive. Well, then you should not insist on 11:40. Well, if you ask your questions. So I still want to clarify with our legal advisor. He did not have enough time to answer why the Legislative Council Secretariat issued a document saying, do you want them to respond to your previous question? So perhaps I'll have them, you had asked the question, I'll have them answer. Legal advisor? Thank you, Ms. Mo. Just now, I had said, what are the effects of directions? It depends on the enabling provisions. Typically, it might not be binding, as Mr. Leung Yu-zhong checked with the dictionary and read out definitions. Not all of the content have a binding element. Yesterday, the legal advisor was referring to the rules of procedure, and today we are talking about an implementation in the legislation. So we have to look at the content of the enabling provisions. So the backgrounds are different. Well, I reluctantly accept that, even though I still retain some doubts. The English usage in 9(1)(a), why doesn't it just say to teach the students to learn to sing? Why does it say to enable? You don't have to say that when we're talking about education. What do you mean by enable?
咁，好奇怪啊！呢啲字眼，呢啲我
This wording is very strange. I feel it's not legal language. And then in 9(1)(b),
咁啊啱喎，咁啊係啦嚇。
好，請你再講。
that is correct to educate the students. Mr. Aw Kim, Chairman, I would like you to understand I had asked questions in my first round, and it's not repetitive. I understand that the question regarding curriculum development unit, it's a new point. So if National Anthem Ordinance is enacted and the curriculum development unit cannot make certain decisions, does that mean they are being circumscribed? For example, how to teach the national anthem, they had their own autonomy. Different schools could have different methods. But now, if we have legislation, and to a certain extent, we have circumscribed their abilities, of course, if Education Bureau wishes to respond, they can do so. Second, I want to ask whether there's any overlap in legislation. Now, James Toe had mentioned 279A Education Ordinance as saying that the officials can state what can be taught in our school curriculum. So I want to say that our National Anthem Ordinance allows the Secretary to give directions. So that means we now have two pieces of legislation. Or it may make one piece of legislation redundant, or you could say it has the same effect. So if the bill says The Secretary for Education gives directions. So how is it going to be executed? Well, Mr. James To asked your first question. Your second question was discussed in the policy. Well, it's a repetitive. I don't agree. Mr. Aonoki, I have been here all morning, and whether it's a repeated question, I would know. It is repetitive. I have answered many times. The Secretary of Education gives directions, and second, when he gives the directions, it is based on the existing mechanism, including education ordinance. So there's no overlap. Now, Secretary, I don't want to argue with you, but when I first mentioned the Curriculum Development Unit, their ambit and whether there was interference, I don't see where you think I have repeated myself. I don't want to argue whether it's the overlap. Let me respond to the first question regarding Curriculum Development Unit. The legislation authorizes the Secretary for Education to give directions, and schools need to teach the national anthem, and the power is delegated to the Secretary. So how is it implemented? It's through the existing education system, the curriculum development unit has a role to play, and how they do it, the mechanism is the same. Mr. Chan Jiqun. Chairman, I want to ask Ms. Claudia Mo's question. So if you draw the line, that means I only have one more speaking turn. But if I'm not repeating myself, I can only ask another turn. And some legislators might not even be able to ask further because you will be drawing the line. So I want to ask the directions. We had some discussion on that. The legal draftsman and the legal advisor say that they can comply or not comply. But if it can be ignored or not ignored, that gives rise to chaos. It's spelled very clearly. Or should we relax it more? So my discussion is, if it's clear cut, then some directions or guidelines can be handled by way of subsidiary legislation. And on this occasion, we have not used the most stringent process. We are just issuing directions. But you see at the end of Clause 9, primary education, secondary education, the meaning has been given by Section 3, Bracket 1 of the Education Ordinance, Cap 279. So the Secretary for Education can also provide remedial measures. So if the schools don't do a good job, can the Secretary for Education exercise his power under the Education Ordinance? Because the most severe reprimand is to suspend school activities. Now, we mentioned that the Secretary's directions for schools require primary schools and secondary schools to teach the national anthem. So Mr. Chan Jiqun is concerned whether schools will be reprimanded if they don't comply. So when we exercise Clause 82, we look at the school performance rather than just one performance issue when we invoke Clause 82. So we will see whether there were severe teaching problems. Mr. Yip Kin Yun. I have a similar question. I have prepared a series of questions, and I hope that after this turn I would have another 2 more speaking opportunities. Otherwise, I need to skip this question in favor of more important questions. I want to follow up on the previous questions. Just now, the question I asked was, Mr. Chan Jiqun was following on that. the notice and directions, the circular memorandum is non-binding, but circular memorandum, we heard two interpretations. One is mandatory. Undersecretary said usually it has to be complied with. That means you can choose to ignore. So is it binding or not? And regulations and the circular memorandum are different. I heard that circular memorandum are temporary or short notices such as competitions. Standing directions are given by way of notices, and now you're saying we can use a notice to notify them of competition and they can sign up. Well, that shouldn't be the case. So I want a response. Should it be a notice or circular memorandum? And could you also clarify the binding effects of directions and the circular memorandum? You'll have to get your answer in the second round.
Mr. Pt2, thank you. 2 minutes. First, I do not agree with the Secretary's understanding that you can still have your autonomy under Basic Law Article 136 because you need to have clear contents. So when you say that you can set your own curriculum, then I think that it is too vague. We were discussing what we mean by history and spirit. The government has not yet come up with a definition of that yet. So do you know under Article 11 of the national law, are there already standards on the definitions of history and spirit of the national anthem law? Secretary, well, when we are localizing legislation, we have not seen papers on specific history and spirit. So does that mean that everyone can use their own interpretation? Does it mean that since under the national law you can have your own interpretation of history and spirit, we can also do the same in Hong Kong? I can only repeat what Undersecretary of Education has said. Schools in Hong Kong have very great autonomy in their directions and curriculum. No follow-up. As I've heard a few members other than two repeating some questions, but it is not as serious as before, so I'm going to exercise my discretion and to draw the line not at 11:45 but at 12 noon. So if you have further questions to ask, please come down and press the speak button immediately. Mr. Alvin Yeung, well, I'd like to follow up on the question on the difference between a notice and circular memorandum. I understand that one is an administrative paper, but it's not legally binding because I've just followed this up with Mr. Ip Kin Yun. So I would like the Education Bureau to clarify. If we're looking at circular memorandum to understand the requirements under Clause 9, is that the most appropriate manner? Before I ask the Undersecretary to respond, I'd like to say that Mr. Ip may have a misunderstanding because previously he was talking about the written responses we gave, where we were responding to his question because he was asking about circular memorandum. So I would like to ask Dr. Choi to address this question. Undersecretary. Thank you. Notices and circular memorandum are both administrative notices to provide guidelines to schools on requirements and standards. When Education Bureau monitors schools, we do not use the notice. We look at the standard of the schools. We have a framework on assessment. We will not only use the notices for monitoring. Perhaps I can ask Mrs. Hong to say a bit more on that. I would like to say that a circular memorandum is a communication tool, but there are many different formats of communication from administrative, financial to curriculum issues. These could all be liaised through circular memorandum, but we would use notices for standing issues. So I cannot say that whether we use this format or not. For a new curriculum guideline, we would need to also provide a curriculum paper notifying schools of a new curriculum. Now, can you help us to understand the education policy, as we are not too clear about that? Does it mean that when we are dealing with Clause 9, the Bureau would use circular memorandum together with other papers to give directions to the schools? So what kind of papers would you include? Can you be brief in your answer, Mrs. Hong? For policies, then we would use notices. But then if we're looking into different subjects, on changes in subjects, then there would also be amendments made. Dr. Kiki Kwok, I'd like to follow up on my question. If someone sues the Education Bureau for not being clear in the enforcement, what can be done? And Mr. Peng reply to this question? Well, the administration can choose who to respond. Secretary. The Secretary for Education has a legal responsibility under Clause 9, and so the legal responsibility only lies in giving directions and not afterwards. So I don't think anyone will be able to query the Secretary for not complying with complying with Clause 9. Mr. Pang, I agree. Yes, I don't think the scenario raised by Dr. Kiki Kwok will happen. All right, I have another question for Education Bureau. Well, now you're going to monitor the schools. Would you also make or enforce the schools to follow instructions by the party? Do you have to be very emotional when you sing the national anthem? Would that also be applicable to our national anthem bill? We do have very clear standards in our different areas. That would include schools, the organizing group, support for students, learning, etc. If you want to pick one out of these many areas, I don't see why that would become a problem. I'm asking about learning and teaching. You might think that the teaching is not enough, that the students who learn are not emotional enough. You do not squeeze out any tears, or you did not stand up when you are sitting in a wheelchair. Many principals of schools tell us that the Education Bureau very often uses political reasons to monitor the schools. We have to say that this is all up to the professional judgment of teachers. I think that you are not familiar with the education system. Therefore, you have such doubts. It would never happen. Dr. Chen Chong-tai, I'm sorry, I'm actually not very clear. So is the Education Bureau using circular memorandum or notice to give directions? Well, I think the answer has already been given. So am I correct in my understanding they're going to use circular memorandum? No, we are using notices. So it's actually a policy for primary and secondary schools. It's actually a standing policy. Well, if you're using this as a direction, would there also be restrictions in how you teach the national anthem? Let's say some teaching materials include how Tianhan died and how the anthem evolved. When you're issuing the notice, would you also list out the standard textbooks to be used? And if the schools do not follow this, what would happen? This is what we are concerned about. I think we have already answered this when we're discussing policies. Please answer again. I have already said that we are open-minded in what material is used. Any reference, any teaching materials that are suitable for students could be used. The Education Bureau would not standardize the teaching materials. All right, I'd like to go back then. Or since you are using this method, how come 9-1A said that you enable the students to learn to sing the national anthem? I think that you are being more strict than the national law. Why do we have to enable the students and not organize the students? This question was already asked. Was it you? But they haven't replied to my question yet. All right. Well, my understanding from the perspective of the Education Bureau is to provide an opportunity for students to learn to sing the national anthem. Dr. Fernando Chang, Clause 9 states that the Secretary for Education must give directions, and the directions are included. I'm not going to repeat my previous question. I'm most concerned, however, with how the one country, two systems principle can be applied, because we do have a different interpretation of being patriotic on the mainland and in Hong Kong. President Xi has made it clear that if you're patriotic to the country, then you must also be patriotic to the party. But in Hong Kong, when we talk about patriotic spirit, it does not necessarily equal to be loyal to the party and to the government. If you do not make clear the guidelines, it might lead to many new questions or new issues arising from this vagueness. If there is no clear direction, then there may be many controversies between the different stakeholders, including parents, teachers. and students. I just want to ask one more time, and please do not evade from my question. The directions you give should it be clear that being patriotic to the country does not equal to being loyal to the party? Secretary, well, we are teaching the students to respect their country, to love their country, to love their own culture. That is very natural. I don't see why there is a need to point out what you should be loyal to. That's my answer. Well, so there is no such standard of being loyal to the party. Mr. James Toll. Oh, thank you. Well, Mr. Ip Kian Yoon is an expert on education. Well, as a lawyer, when I read Clause 9 and to look into bracket 1 saying the Secretary for Education must give directions, can you explain to me that to give directions, can you give me what format of a circular memorandum you would provide, and that wouldn't be in breach of the law? And please list out and which legislation you abide by. I'm reading the Chinese version now. You list out 9(1)(a) and (b). Unless there are different meanings. Otherwise, why can you not use B as the basis? 1, to educate the students on the history, on the spirit, and on the etiquette. You don't have to divide up A and B. I don't see why there is a need to separate A and B. What is the difference between enabling the students to learn to sing the national anthem and educating the students on the playing and singing of the national anthem? Can you combine the two, Secretary? 9(1)(a) is to provide an opportunity for the students to learn, and 9(1)(b) states the education. And I think it is clearer to divide the two. Well, why? I mean, from the legal perspective, is there actually a difference in the legal requirement? Well, 9(1) is providing opportunity, and B is actually an outcome. Ms. Claudia Mo.
Western world that nationalism, or indeed true patriotism, is to protect your country against the government. Now that's a very different version or interpretation from Mr. Xi Jinping's. I'm wondering, you keep talking about the history, fine, learning history is fine, but then the spirit of the national anthem. I mean, how national is national to students at international schools where there's so many students of different nationalities? So how exactly does this apply, really?
用英文問多一條問題，或者局長作答。
Well, you're using English to ask the exact same question. Well, there is another copyright, if you ask it in Chinese and English, so it's different. Please don't say that I am repeating the question, but you are repeating it in substance. I'm not sure people have asked about international schools.
National schools, how are they supposed to follow all these directions?
Ms. Claudia Mo, you're wasting your time. Someone has already asked this question this morning, and not only once, Secretary. Undersecretary. Well, I have answered this question earlier. International schools also have to teach the students to respect the national anthem and international schools are very multi-diversified. When we discuss this with international schools, they have never felt that there is no need to learn the national anthem of the country they are in and not to respect other cultures.
The learning. But then what about the introduction of so-called patriotism, Chinese patriotism? They're not Chinese.
係，局長簡潔啲答，唔該。
我哋冇
Please be brief, Undersecretary. We did not require this under Clause 9. We're just saying that we are providing the opportunity for students to learn to sing the anthem.
Mr. Chairman, Clause 9 suggests that the Secretary of Education must give directions inter there to educate the students on the history and spirit of the national
What's the point of
anthem.
reading out what's in front
I'm answering your
of
question.
our eyes?
你俾個機會
You're
我
not
講。
answering.
OK，你再撳掣啦，咁樣。
ridiculous
范國威議員2分鐘，唔該。
Mr. Gary Fan, 2 minutes. Now, I have 3 questions. I would like to press a second round. I want to follow up on my previous question on would there be an opportunity in the future that the school would call the police for this bill to be enforced within school campus? Well, right now you say that it is encouraging. It is just a direction. Would it become a controversy in the future because in March of this year, St. Paul's Convent School did call the police to complain against their own students taking pictures outside of the school. So I am just concerned that would this happen in the future, that people would use this to become sort of pressure on students, or that it would become a tool to stop them from doing what they want. Well, right now on the mainland, you can see that there are schools that are Japanese schools, there are American schools, and other international schools. That's listed very clearly. So would actually these international students on the mainland are also required to learn to sing the Chinese national anthem and to learn the etiquette for playing and singing the national anthem? And is this what we need to do in Hong Kong? Would there be a difference in the understanding?
Frankly, please answer succinctly. I've already answered similar questions before. The national anthem law on the mainland applies to all primary and secondary schools, and the same in Hong Kong. And we only require them to teach the national anthem. There is no requirement on patriotism. I draw the line now. Mr. Roy Kwong, 2 minutes. Thank you, Chairman. A member asked, what if a student deliberately insult the national anthem? What will happen? And it was said that for those below 10, he would be free from criminal liability, and from those aged between 10 and 14, then it depends on whether there is the intent. And what about those above 14? I was answering to a question raised by Mr. Tony Z. According to our law, those who are over 14 will be treated as any other person in Hong Kong. It depends on whether his behavior has breached the criminal elements in the bill. That is quite scary. I might have got it wrong, but if you are 14, you're probably in S2 or S3. Those who are below 10 exempt from criminal liability. From 10 to 14 depends on whether you is a deliberate act or is it just a naughty act. For those over 14, I think this is quite draconian. How is it relevant to this clause? Well, in schools, we very often have students that are 15 or 16, and how does it differ from those inside or outside schools? Well, in schools, there are those who are still 15 and 16. They are still young, and they may inadvertently be caught, and they might face a very draconian charge. P.S. In Hong Kong, it doesn't matter whether you are inside the school or outside. We don't have a different age limit for imposing criminal liability. But as the Undersecretary said, if somebody decides to report a crime that happened inside a school, we have no control over that. But that would cause extreme pressure on schools, because there are differential treatments for those below 10, between 10 and 14, and those above 14. We understand that this is a fact, but does that mean that if someone or third party reports such a behavior to the law enforcement agencies, will there be any difference in terms of enforcement and punishment? Whether it is within or without a school, there is nothing to stop a third party from doing anything, and the schools, according to the Undersecretary, will not do such a thing, right? Mr. Alvin Young. Mr. Tam. Well, I still have another round. I want to know. I already said so. But I pressed the button to speak. Yes, I already told you the order. All right. I thought they're all erased. No. Mr. Alvin Young's turn now, to be followed by Mr. Au Nok Kin, Mr. Ray Chen, Mr. Ip Kin Yu, Mr. James To, Dr. Chang Chong Tan, Dr. Fernando Zhou, Mr. Claudia Mo, Mr. Gary Fan, okay? 5 minutes. Please count from 0. Mr. Alvin Young, well, what's your point of order? I've been following the meeting. I've heard that there would be the line drawn, and at first it was 11:30, 11:40 or 12, but that doesn't mean that it is reasonable. I've only asked one round this morning. I've left the room a number of times for official duties. Yes, I understand that you have to be efficient, you have to manage time, and you have to complete the work of the BC within 3 months. Is it because you think that it's not possible to complete your work within 3 months, and therefore you only allow us to ask 3 hours, ask questions for 3 hours? This is the first time I've heard of the 3-month deadline. No, this is not a point of order. You were here, but you didn't press the request to speak button on several occasions. Well, you had official things to attend to. Now, during a meeting, you're supposed to be present at the meeting. I have already said that I believe we have had ample discussion. I have made a decision, and please respect the rules of procedure. Mr. Alvin Young, your turn, please. I'd like to ask Mr. Pang this question. Using Clause 9 as example, as Mr. James To pointed out just now, Clause 9 can be dealt with under the Education Ordinance or related regulations. I'd like to know whether there are similar scenarios in Hong Kong, i.e. in 9A we have provisions to give directions but no penalty. And I'd like to know whether there are similar situations. Anyone from the administration? The purpose of Clause 9 is to implement Article 11 of the National Anthem law. So the responsibility is put on the S4E to give directions. For our schools to deal with issues, and that is under 9(1)(a) and (b), and we believe that this is an appropriate approach. Mr. Pang, have we got similar situations in 9(a)? Within 9, there are directions, but there are no penalties. Why can't clause 9 be put under the education ordinance directly? The government has chosen not to do so this time. I'd like to know whether there are other legislation similar in Hong Kong. So there is a clause that gives a direction, but there is no penalty provisions included. I don't think that it is not appropriate to put it in clause 9 and not in the education ordinance. I'm not commenting on whether it is appropriate. I just like to know whether there are similar arrangements. Within your knowledge, are there similar arrangements? We don't have such information right now. Perhaps you provide a reply in writing afterwards. Mr. Al-Nokin, 2 minutes. I've only got one question in this round. That is, in our statute, apart from the education ordinance and the tertiary institutions ordinance, are there other ordinances that enable the S4E to make directions as required in clause 9 here? Because my concern is how much autonomy do we have in our education sector? Because some members ask whether patriotism is equivalent to being loyal to the party. Because in my teaching career, I've seen teachers that taught the national anthem. At the same time, they talked about civil the war within the country and how the People's Republic, the People's Republic would be sing, or the Republic of China's national anthem was to be sung. And if in future a teacher does the same, he might be suppressed under the bill. So I'd like to know whether there are other pieces of legislation with the same formulation of the national anthem bill. Under Secretary, as far as I know, clause 9 requires the SYE to give directions, and the others, for the others, they have been proved to be effective. In other words, is there none? I don't have any information with me now, but I believe there should be none. Mr. Ray Chan, I want a quorum call. Please press the quorum bell.
陳志全議員2分鐘。
Mr. Ray Chen, 2 minutes, or rather 1 minute. One suggestion and one question. My suggestion is 3 elements are included in the directions to learn to sing the national anthem, to learn the history and spirit of the national anthem, and the etiquette for playing. I think it's most important to teach students the national anthem ordinance, because it's not against the law not to know how to sing the national anthem, but it is an offense not to know what the national anthem ordinance is about. So the most practical thing to do is to educate students on this ordinance itself. All right, you have introduced the someone responsible under this clause, and that is the Education Secretary for Education, but there is no penalty. Whereas in Article 11 of the national law, it says that the national anthem shall be included in the curricula for primary and secondary schools. There is no responsible person in Article 11. Now, when we go to Clause 10, we know that the Communications Authority, this is an organization, and it is responsible. The Article 11 in the national law is the onus is on primary and secondary schools, whereas in Clause 9 here we use our ordinary educational system, and we require the S4E to give directions. Mr. Kim Yun, thank you, Chairman. Clause 9 says that the S4E should give directions. Some members asked whether the directions would include the contents under the slashes, the dashes. All right, these are statutory requirements. The directions should include these things and no others. And if there will be other content in the directions, what will it be? Secretary, the notice is being prepared for sure. We will follow Clause 9. It will not include something other than Clause 9. So you are not to include other things. There is no requirement in this clause to include other things. What about B1? The spirit and history of the national anthem that has attracted the greatest concern. So is there would there be an official version on what is the history and spirit of the NA? The guidelines will require schools to provide opportunities for students to learn these things. There won't be an official version. As I said, there would not be a specified teaching materials and viewpoint, but we would teach students to respect the NA. Mr. Kim Yun, I understand that you are from the Education Functional Constituency, and you are their representative here. And if your other comments, please give us these questions in writing. But I've done a number of times. All right, Mr. James Toh, not here. Dr. Cheng Chung Tai. I'd like to follow up on the question asked by Mr. Ip Kim Yun. Members asked about the situation in international schools. I'm not so concerned as to whether you have directions to require them to teach the NA. In some international schools, because there are students of different nationalities, it is like United Nations. They teach different national anthems. So will your directions only require schools to teach the Chinese national anthem?
Maybe you would be dissatisfied they're teaching different national anthems at the same time, because there are international schools teaching different national anthems, including the Chinese national anthem at the same time. So could you clarify in the guidelines, international schools or private schools, how they should conduct their teaching? Well, the guidelines require that an opportunity be provided to learn and sing the national anthem. It does not exclude other national anthems. I want to ask when this Education Bureau has issued the directions legally, will you need to do any monitoring or assessment? If you feel the school has not complied with the directions, what kind of outcomes are there? Well, the Education Bureau relies on its existing mechanism to deal with these affairs. They won't be specific notices. Well, what are the outcomes? Well, I have mentioned many times the schools are accountable to society, to the public, to the school sponsoring body. So we focus on education quality and the education opportunities afforded to students. There is a total assessment. We don't look at one piece of law. Gary Fan, today is the 100th anniversary of the 4th of May movement, and I want to concentrate on Clause 9 to Clause 9B 1 and 2. So today's officials have not responded accurately to the history and spirit of the national anthem. Now, the 4th of May movement has now been distorted by we should only have democracy and science in the 4th of May movement, and that this message has been distorted. So when we talk about history and spirit of the national anthem, what history and spirit are we talking about? The lyrics to the national anthem request us to stand up and not be slaves. Well, we want to coalesce we need to unite, we need to coalesce. And when we say we do not want to be slaves, is that part of the anthem? Shouldn't we exercise critical thinking? The background in history to the lyrics, we need to understand that when the country is in the face of crisis, we need to unite and coalesce. So President Xi has distorted the message of the 4th of May movement. Well, Chairman, we have responded many times this morning. We are teaching the students history and spirit of the national anthem. Mr. Yip asked, will there be an official version? And the answer is no. We said that we will use the existing mechanism to issue these instructions. Mr. James Toll. Now, after this, you require schools to comply. And previously, in the offense sections, you talked about insulting and so on. So we have the obscene article ordinance or child pornography ordinance. There are academic exemptions. So, for example, if they are honestly teaching a student, they would tell you, the students, that they need to respect the national anthem. They would have to provide examples of booing and so on, or descriptions and so on, or even show video clips and YouTube. So can we have these types of exemptions? In general, there should be exemptions. When we discussed Clause 7, I had said that Clause 7.5 is an exemption for fair reporting. So we now move on to Clause 10. Thank you, Chairman. Clause 10 is inclusion in sound broadcasting and domestic television program services. It is in relation to the National Anthem Act, Article 12 and 13. So it regulates recordings, video and audio recordings. We also want to regulate the TV broadcasts. The Communications Authority can make a determination or direction in relation to the broadcasting license, requiring the licensee to broadcast the national anthem by an announcement in the public service or material in the public interest. There can also be a determination or direction that has been made in relation to the broadcasting license. The license may be required to broadcast the national anthem by announcement in the public interest or material. And in subclause 3, the Communications Authority must make a determination in they need to broadcast the national anthem by announcement in the public interest. Clause 10, bracket 4 and 5, can stipulate the chief executive to set a date for the purpose of subsection bracket 3, and a stipulation under subsection 4 must be published in the Gazette as soon as practicable, and it is not a subsidiary legislation. And in subclause 6, we also need a definition for broadcasting license. Today we have in attendance Mr. Geng Ji Cheng and Ms. Lo Git Wai. Ms. Lo Git Wai is Assistant Director, Broadcasting Office of Communications Authority. And Mr. Keith Jiang is from Commerce and Economic Development. Well, in our TV broadcast, I think it's 6 o'clock. Many years ago, N years ago, they had a broadcast license, and then they had to fulfill certain conditions. So did you have that requirement back then? For example, every day at a certain time they have to broadcast the national anthem. And here we have to set a date, and it involves the CE. Is this additional, or is this just your way of notifying Beijing that you've issued instructions? I'm not sure. Have you made extra instructions, because this requires licensees to give you airtime to broadcast? Are the existing conditions insufficient, or do you need a mechanism to tell the mainland that you have instructions in place? So could I have that clarified from the professional departments? So let's have Mr. Keith Jiang. Well, clause 10 reflects the broadcast of government APIs. In our existing mechanism, the Licenses Institute needs to broadcast the government APIs, and the government requires a broadcast of 1 minute per hour, and the government will issue the timetable a week in advance. And today's national anthem broadcasting is also in accordance with this procedure. So why do we have to set a date? Why does the CE set a date? Well, just now we explained the mechanism is the one we have in place for TV broadcasts. In subclause 4, where the chief executive may stipulate a date for the purpose of subsection bracket 3. That's because in the National Act we have some important festivities and dates where the national anthem will be broadcast. So in subclause 4, we have provided an additional arrangement. That is, if necessary, there will be a mechanism where the CE, for the purpose of subsection 3, can stipulate a date. So, but otherwise we are using the existing mechanism. So we have two mechanisms. One is in the licensing regime, 1 minute per hour, and in enacting the national anthem ordinance, we are adding. So the CE can set a date. So if the CE says that 365 days are all important, and we can broadcast 365 times per year. Or you might say only 1st of July or whatever significant date is appropriate, and the CE has the authority. But then we are interfering with the business environment because they are spending money to bid for a broadcast license, and you may require them to broadcast every day. So we also have to look at subclause 3. The communications authority must make a determination and so on. But subclause 4 just says that the CE can stipulate a date. Mr. Fernando Chung? I also want to clarify, regarding the broadcasting licensing regime, so this is targeting the broadcasting companies, that they will need to play government APIs during certain periods. So in clause 10, it is making the same arrangement for the national anthem video or audio recording to be broadcast, and currently the requirement is 1 minute per hour. The broadcast time does the broadcast authority, or I don't know which government department has the authority to set a time. Let's say they might require 5 minutes per hour. Can they do that? Or 10 minutes per hour? Or in subclause 3 and subclause 4, where the CE, aside from the licensing regime, they can make temporary decisions. Let's say in the coming week, every hour we need to broadcast 20 minutes. Does the law allow the government to do this? Well, the current mechanism in the licensing regime requires that the overall time schedule, free TV, they are required to broadcast not more than 1 minute per hour. And existing regime, telecom authority instructs the government, the broadcasting company, to broadcast the coming week's API material. And in clause 10, we are relying on the existing mechanism, so we won't have more broadcast time than currently scheduled. I was asking about clause 10, subclause 3.4. So aside from our existing licensing requirements, do subclauses 3 and 4 allow the CE to stipulate dates outside of the licensing requirement to broadcast audio and video recordings? Well, in bracket 4, the chief executive may stipulate a date that she can do so. But in practice, the telecoms authority will consider the timetable, so it won't be more than the licensing requirement. So the requirement right now is 1 minute per hour. So even if the CE wants certain dates to broadcast the video and audio, it will still come under the restriction of 1 minute, not more than 1 minute, not less than 1 minute per hour. So is this a legal requirement, or the telecom authorities' discretion? It's stated clearly in the license. Is it a legal requirement, a licensing requirement, or to be decided by telecom authority? The broadcasting license is approved by the CE in council, so it is stated in the license. Mr. Tan Ji-chun. First of all, I want some information from the government. The government says the APIs will be played 1 minute per hour. So when did the government deploy the APA time to broadcast the national anthem? And how many channels are broadcasting every day? How many times they broadcast per day? I'd like a response. Because my understanding of this clause is the government broadcasts the national anthem in the free TV. So what is the impact of this clause? So even without this clause, the government has a long-established mechanism in place. So you can convert all the APIs and convert that to national anthem. And even though it might affect your audience viewership, so after enacting Clause 10 and including the national anthem in the APIs, you say they won't have more broadcasting. Well, it would depend on how they deploy that 1 minute API. So could you confirm once again that Clause 10 has not broadened the telecom authorities' powers? So before the national anthem ordinance, the drafting of Clause 10 is restricting the telecom's authority rather than the licensed broadcasting companies. Well, Mr. Chan's question requires us to look at the reasoning for Clause 10. In Article 12 and 13 of the National Act, it requires on significant festivities, dates, the broadcasting companies need to broadcast the national anthem. Now, this is the National Act. So when the National Act is implemented in Hong Kong, we have to consider Hong Kong situation, including the media operation, including our existing mechanism. So in enacting the National Act, the drafting of Clause 10 required the broadcasting of national anthem be it has to come under the broadcasting of APIs, and that is the drafting intention of Clause 10. And the way it's drafted is that we require licensed broadcasting companies to broadcast government APIs. And in this total time slot, which API and which frequency, this is the decision of the government news agency. So you mentioned just now the what are the time slots, the API time slots. We can provide that after the meeting, but this is how the mechanism operates. Now, the Secretary referred to Articles 12 and 13 of the National Act. But it does not reflect the broadcasting company's initiative. It is just your mandatory requirement. You even need to produce special programs for these in order to have compliance with Articles 12 and 13.
Mr. Aonoki, 4 minutes. Secretary, in relation to Clause 10, I have some questions. Every night, we would see APIs on TV every night, but we see that it states in Clause 10, bracket 4, that the Chief Executive may stipulate a date for the purposes. So I'm sure it's actually 365 days a year. So there's already a specific time for the playing of the national anthem each year. Right now, our legislation already allows us to do that. Why would you need to state specifically clause 9 bracket 4 here then? Chairman, I have replied earlier that there may be some special occasions on which the national anthem should be played, and therefore we just want to make sure there is a mechanism for us to do that. So the mechanism is for stipulating a date. However, in operation, we would just use the operation mechanism under the government APIs. Well, that's exactly what I'm saying, Secretary. You can use the current mechanism to do that. You don't have to specify bracket 4 here. It does not give you new authority. Am I correct, Chairman? This actually reflects the national anthem law that on certain days the national anthem must be played, but in Hong Kong we cannot directly say that, oh, you have to proactively start promoting. We have to use our current mechanism. Therefore, this is actually in relation to national anthem law. Well, that's exactly what I am saying. You do not specify what the media should do, and therefore you use the current mechanism to ask the media what to write about. But now, you already have a channel, yet you're trying to open up another channel. I think some of the questions have been raised by the Hong Kong Bar Association. If you look at paragraph 25, part 4, it said clauses 9 and 10.
Powers of the government and other statutory bodies to promote the national anthem in the regime of the Education Ordinance. 呢個之前啦，我哋唔好理啦。And the other licensing statutory framework in ways they think fit. The enactment of 即係後邊咧，佢後邊亦都有佢 clause.
Clause 9 also states that the current mechanism already gives you the authority. Or the Secretary said you want to reflect the national anthem law, that there should be autonomy within the media. That's my view. It seems that the current mechanism is already enough. Thank you for your recommendation. Mr. Holden Chow, Chairman. We want to accurately educate the public. Well, other than having clause 9 to include this in primary and secondary education, now clause 10 also talks about broadcast announcements at certain times of the day. I think that is quite a good arrangement, and it's reasonable. We need to comply with the national anthem law, and at the same time ensure that it is localized to suit our laws. I hear the other party keep on saying that there would be additional playings of the national anthem. But it seems from your answer that even with clause 10, it's not going to affect the current playing mechanism. Well, that is my understanding from your responses. So I don't think we need to be overly concerned. unless they think that one additional playing is too much. We want to educate the public. If you have objecting views, that's probably because you don't like the national anthem and you don't want to hear. This is just my view and comment. I think it is very reasonable and appropriate to have such an arrangement. Thank you. Mr. Gary Fan, I really don't understand what Mr. Holden Charles said has to do with clause 10. I now to refer to clause 10. Where does it say that that in clause 10 are there any changes made to the wording, much like the should and must that we were arguing before? Well, I want to ask about 10. One, it said that this section applies if under the terms and conditions of a broadcasting license, the licensee may be required to include material in the public interest and license service. And two, by a determination or direction that's been made in relation to the broadcasting license, licensee may be required to broadcast the national anthem by an announcement in the public interest or material in the public interest and license service. So that makes me unclear. Is there actually a repetition in 1 and 2, or do you actually can take out 1 and this is already enough? Because right now, because the current mechanism already allows the government to have APIs or to include material in the public interest in license service. So why do you have to repeat it under 10 bracket 1 and to just not go directly to 2? Because 2 I think is already quite clear. Mr. Peng. Bracket 1 states the background so that you would understand when we are applying bracket 2, it's based on the background of 1. So 2 is only applicable when there is 1. So you mean to say that without 1, your meaning would not be clear? That you the terms and conditions of a broadcasting license cannot be complied. So you are saying that if APIs are in relation to other government work, that would not work. Well, without 1 as a background, then you would not know what determination or direction we are referring to. So 1 helps the reader with the understanding what 2 is based on. Dr. Fernando Cheung. 3 minutes. Chairman, APIs on the national anthem. I'm not sure whether there are any directions by the Communications Authority. Very often the APIs do not have sign language. They might have subtitles but no sign language. Can you require that sign language also be provided in the APIs? Secretary. Chairman, my understanding is that there is no such requirement of APIs, but we would take this into consideration. Because my understanding is that APIs send out important information, and those and I see that there's also an official sign language national anthem on the mainland. Therefore, it is not correct to not provide this in sign language in your APIs. Well, today in LegCo, we also provide simultaneous sign language for our meetings. I think the government should keep up with times. For important messages and information. You must first include sign language, especially in your APIs. I don't think it is too difficult, and it should not be an economic or financial concern. Yes, thank you for your consideration and your comment. So, can you also make it clear in the APIs that you would also provide a sign language version? Well, we state in our draft that we would use the current mechanism. Your recommendation, we will bring it back to the government and to consider all APIs, especially for the national anthem. So I don't think you should. We need to include this into the legislation. Well, I think you should actually clarify it, and that all APIs be the same to include sign language version. Thank you, Mr. Aonokim. 3 minutes. Oh, Mr. Holden Chow just left. Well, I've been very respectful to him. I hope he would not say that we are trying to do something here. I just want to ask that since you are regulating the media under the Communications Authority and under a broadcasting license, and that we are all now drawing up legislation for the national anthem bill, and that we have clear procedures. If one communication or if a broadcasting company violates the legislation, so who would have the authority to penalize the broadcaster? Well, we have not made it clear very here. So for APIs, it would be under the regulation of the Communications Authority. So we would refer to the penalty under the Communications Authority for APIs. Well, I hope I'm understanding this correctly. So you are just looking into the telecommunications and communications authority. But here there are some administrative procedures. And there might be consequences if you violate some of the administrative procedures. I want to make this clear. Let's say the chief executive wants to stipulate a date, and there is to be a gazette. Would you also use the Communications Authority to handle any breaches and violations of the legislation? Well, I think I can refer you to 10(3). It is stated in 3. All right, I understand. I just have one other view, that is from the Hong Kong Bar Association.
Legal consequences, they ought to be made clear in the bill. In the premises, there is no justification and need to enact clause 9 and 10 of the bill as they now stand. 咁我嘅意思就係話，如果係罰則上面咧，咁當然今日嘅對答，我相信咧，就算。
Well, unfortunately, if this is brought to court, I hope that this could be used as a reference. The Hong Kong Bar Association said that if there is a legal consequence, it must be made clear. I hope that you would take this view. Mr. Chen Ji-chun, 3 minutes. Thank you. I would like to first respond to what Mr. Holden Chow said. Well, I didn't hear any one of us saying that there is an overplaying of the national anthem. My question to Secretary was, even without the national anthem bill, you do not comply with with the clauses with the correct etiquette for the playing and singing of the national anthem. Or let's say you broadcast the wrong APIs, then would there be any enforcement? Because I remember when I worked in the radio station, sometimes we might press the wrong button. Let's say if you accidentally press the wrong button, you play the wrong one, then what would happen? Well, we want to make clear our bill in writing. 10.1 specifies that the communications authority may be required here you have used a passive. You said the licensee may be required by determination or direction of the Communications Authority in Clause 10. Can you try to clarify it? Mr. Pang, thank you. When we are looking into the determination or direction of the Communications Authority, it is based on the terms and wording used in broadcasting license. Well, as the that used the term may be, we also adopted the same term here. So you're just copying it from the original license. Well, yes, we have to reflect the substance of the license terms, and therefore we also use the same term may be. So you're not going to explain to me why it is may be, because, well, the original is may be, so you also use the term may be here. I'm not going to waste time talking about that anymore. Well, the API, it's sort of like a schedule, a timetable. So when you have all your APIs, do you have to fight for a time slot? Let's say you have a co-location, or you have the new territories, Northwestern development, etc. So who decides on which and when the APIs would be played? Does the Communications Authority or who is in charge of deciding when the national anthem API would be played? Well, so we would look into the priority that in different times, then we would play different APIs. For example, when the budget is about to come out, then we would broadcast the APIs on budget. Mr. Pang, do you have any legal advisor? You have some supplement. Well, actually, it's a bit of background information. Why the term may be is used in Clause 10 bracket 1. It is because in reality there are many different broadcasting licenses. Some are free licenses, some are licenses with a fee. So 10 is only applicable to those broadcasting licenses in which the Communications Authority can require them to broadcast APIs. So here there must be used the term may be, because some of the channels do not broadcast APIs. All right, time is up. For those of you who wish to speak yet do not have the time to do so yet, we are going to continue next time. We are going to continue with Clause 10 next time. I do not have any AOBs. I now close the meeting.